Hello, and welcome to this edition of Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm your host, Lincoln Mitchell, political analyst and author of The Democracy Promotion Paradox. The relationship between Russia and the Trump candidacy, and now the Trump presidency, has been a puzzle. In the first few months of the Trump administration, we have seen congressional investigations that have failed to bring real clarity and have left us with more questions than answers. The administration has denied any wrongdoing, all the while sending mixed messages about its policies towards Russia. There are many unanswered questions. What was Russia's role in our election? What are the implications of the relationships between various people in the Trump administration and Moscow? What ties are there between the president himself and Moscow? And what does this all mean to the rest of us? Today we hope to explore some of these questions. I'm fortunate to have a great guest joining me today, Adrian Karatnycky. He's the author of New Nations Rising, The Fall of the Soviets, and the Challenge of Independence. Adrian, thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
So I want to begin with maybe a big picture question. We've spent many months trying to determine what the Trump-Russia relationship is. I don't know that we have any answers for sure, but there seems to be a lot going on. What do you think are the main aspects of this, the main things about which we should be concerned, at which we should be looking?
Well, I think that the first thing you can say, to paraphrase Winston Churchill, is that this is a mystery wrapped in an enigma inside a tower. And I think what we're dealing with is, unfortunately, a certain kind of blithe informality in which, and lack of professionalism in which this insurgent Trump candidacy started. And it kind of like pulled people in from all over without a lot of, I would say, ideological coherence. It was as chaotic in its worldview as the tweets of the president are. And so it's created a lot of points of contact between Russia, as has now been revealed, and Russian officials, and a lot of people who were pretty marginal to the U.S. political debate, except when they connected to an outsider insurgent candidate who surprised a lot of people by getting elected president. And what that, I think, did was it brought into the campaign and partially into the presidency relationships that are that look very suspicious. They combine the commercial interests, a kind of informality, and I think that they suggest that Russia was very interested in using these networks of sort of the Trump hangers-on and the Trump advisors, building relationships with them and having ways of trying to influence. And the other question is, was there a kind of a back and forth between these, I would call them both hangers-on, some of them insiders, some of them business associates or functionaries of the Trump world that were part of this very odd campaign. And I think that's where all these problems lie. We can talk a little bit more about how we can parse out all these issues, but I think that the problem started because Trump was not a politician. Trump never went through the scrutiny and the discipline of election campaigns, and kind of brought with him a lot of questionable stuff. And some of it remains in the White House, some of it may be in the administration, but this is why these investigations have to be so thorough, because these are the people that got Trump into trouble, and maybe Trump himself got himself into trouble, was precisely because he did not have the discipline or the experience, and his associates, did not have the discipline and the experience of government service and that kind of heavy scrutiny.
So maybe to follow up a little bit on this notion of informality, because I think you're very much onto something. But, and as we know, in the foreign policy world, there are people who have, formal titles, Deputy Secretary of State, academic positions, advisors, and then people who are on the fringes. They do a little business, they dabble in a little policy, they have some useful relationships. Some of them may be too close to the Kremlin, some may not be. There's a whole lot of people like that. And I think that's what you're talking about when you talk about informality. But we've seen informal campaigns before, right? There has to be a leap between or a connection between the informality and now we're going to have a relationship with Russia that is more complex. There are many people who are informal and know that, well, I'm also not going to do this. I'm not going to take money to go be on RT because that just doesn't feel right, right?
Well, I mean, the really paradoxical thing is General Flynn, the now disgraced and former national security advisor, who did have government and military experience, was one of the people that seems to have behaved the most recklessly. He was a lobbyist for Turkey. He took money from Russian institutions that are regarded as propaganda and disinformation institutions, and he took fees from Russian companies and injected himself into the campaign, and it is alleged had a lot of backdoor communications with Russian officials during the campaign. Now, some of those may have been legitimate, wanting to gain intelligence and prep yourself in the event that your candidate wins. But there is a serious question that because he was financially linked to the Russians, that there may have been some less than transparent communications, and it's very clear that he's one of these weaker links. But then you have this whole group of people who are married to people from Russia, or married to people from Ukraine, or part of the entourage. You have people. There's the whole narrative of people who are buying up Trump properties, the possibility that Trump was being financed by substantial amounts of Russian money. All of this just creates a kind of a mess that really has to be parsed out. And why does it have to be parsed out? Because of the strange bromance between Trump and Putin that we saw throughout the campaign, the signaling of Russia to attack, to break into and to find Hillary Clinton's emails, and the kind of the signals of appreciation and admiration for Trump that were visible throughout that campaign. All of this created there's just a huge amount of smoke, and the problem with a huge amount of smoke is not just that there may be fires there, but that the smoke obscures your getting to those fires because it's just so heavy.
And when there is a fire, more people die from the smoke than from the fire in many cases. But there seems to be a battery of questions here that we're talking about why this is important. And I want to go to one that is kind of, in my view, at the heart of this. Because we know that Russia was involved in our election in a way that does not makes many people feel uncomfortable, in a way that clearly helped Donald Trump more than Hillary Clinton. We don't know exactly the links between that involvement and all of these kind of gray area ties that you've been discussing. It is possible that there was no connection, and this is all just a coincidence. I wouldn't describe that as likely, but it is in the realm of possibility. It's probably more possible that that's not the case. And there's two questions that then come to mind. One, what really happened? What level of coordination actually happened? And that's a question that I think at least some people are trying to get at. But the other is, in my view, even more difficult, which is, did this change the outcome of the election? And I have some thoughts on the latter, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on both first.
Well, I think that initially the idea was that the Russian intervention in our election was primarily through the instrument of Russian government-backed or government hackers who provided and leaked information on internal emails related to the Sanders candidacy and internal emails that were compromising of the Clinton campaign, and that had a bit of a resonance. And then there was the question of whether there was some kind of collusion with representatives of the Trump campaign. But then there is this other factor of the use of social media, electronic media, trolls, the use of bots that was specifically focused on in effect, disaffected Sanders voters to create a kind of cynicism about the Clinton campaign that reduced their enthusiasm and could have had some influence. That is a separate, I think, investigation that'll be very hard to prove, but it's extremely important to understand, to get the final facts about the scale of it, and to have a discussion about whether it might have swayed the election, because we need to know, other democracies need to know whether they are susceptible to that kind of thing. China could start doing this. Other countries with large resources that want to influence the outcomes in the Western democracies could start exploiting that system. So I think that's one set of questions. The second set of questions, was there collusion? At what level was there collusion? Was there cooperation? And was there maybe even a quid pro quo? And the third layer is, does it go all the way to the top? And was there, you know, as is often the downfall of these things, a signal sent that triggered these kinds of events within the Trump team that leads up to the president or people very high up and close to him, or whether then afterwards was there some kind of a cover-up of that fact. So I think those are the things that, I mean, and that's a very, you know, meaty, rich array of things to look at, which is why this is going to have a very, you know, I think this thing's going to go on for a very long time. This is not a simple, clear-cut 2 or 3 issues that you're looking at. It's just this tangled web of issues that has to be followed.
To go back to your notion of informality, this campaign in the really until the very end, wasn't just by contemporary standards an informal campaign. It was a small campaign. There were not layers the way they were in, say, a Hillary Clinton campaign or Mitt Romney's campaign. So this question of did it go to the top would be different in a different campaign. And this question, this case is a little different. But I want to raise another issue, which is, you know, it's now the beginning of baseball season in New York and elsewhere. And so I'm going to make a baseball analogy, which is that if you lose a ball game 10-9, there's a lot of things that could have happened, right? If the first baseman hadn't made the error in the 3rd inning, if that had been strike 3 rather than ball 4 in the 7th inning, you get the point. Now, when we talk, this question about did it change the outcome, what always strikes me is the debate, whether it's in a Twitter exchange or a forum, always goes something like this. Well, there was Russian intervention and it was a very close election. And the next response is Hillary Clinton ran a bad campaign. And there was yes, but it was very close in these 3 states. Yes, but she didn't campaign hard enough in those 3 states. And both sides are telling the truth. All of those things are true. There are 20 reasons why Donald Trump won this election. One of them might be that Democrats nominated the wrong person. One of them might be that she made strategic mistakes. But if only one of them is this, then that is enough to sway the election. So it seems that again, it's very hard to prove, but it's almost equally hard to disprove.
Well, look, I think that there's an issue that is hard to overcome, and that is, I think we have to accept the legitimacy of the process. We also have to accept that you know, if people are susceptible to the pressures of Russian propagandists in St. Petersburg who are constructing messages, that it's their responsibility, that they were susceptible and they were already soft in their support for Hillary Clinton, and that what the Russians were saying was not just manipulation, but it was manipulation of something that people were inclined to believe. So I don't want to create this, image of Russia as this all-powerful force. So again, I think in the end, I tend to believe that it is the responsibility of, you know, intelligent voters and motivated voters to make their own electoral decisions. And they are subject to all sorts of influences. And yes, they're on social networks, and that's influential, but they also watch television. They're also susceptible to the mainstream media.
It's a rich and diverse media environment.
So I think, in my view, I think it's a harder case to prove, but I do think that it is possible that in certain close elections, and again, we don't know the scale of it. We really need to know how large was the Russian operation. We know Russia spends hundreds of millions of dollars on TV propaganda throughout the world through RT, Russian television, which is on cable, Russia Today, which is on cable stations throughout the democratic world and also in the developing world. We know that they use bots and they have technological means to, you know, you put up an article, you publish an article, there'll be 50 comments, and 20 of them will be these weird comments from a guy named Doug, whose language structure is not traditional English. It's sort of, and you kind of figure, you stop reading that stuff. But there are actually some people that do read this stuff, and they get into the fray, and they may be motivated. But I still think in the end we have to sort of say, if you're a person that gets so into politics that you're reading the comments and you're following hundreds of Twitter comments, you're really responsible for your own decision.
And I think it also speaks to that we now have a globalization of elections. And we see this around the world, particularly in countries where both the US and Russia may be involved in that globalization process. But I want to maybe move a little bit into the present now, which is, so we've had this election, we have Donald Trump as president, how we got there, what role Russia has. We may or may never get the answer to that question, but people are trying to investigate that. But there was this assumption among many that this was going to be a real shift in American policy towards Russia. real shift in American policy towards Ukraine and in the Middle East because of Russia's role in the Middle East. I'm wondering how that looks now. And just to give some examples, the most obvious example is the Tomahawk missile attack on Syria that President Trump ordered recently. And that is something that, whether or not he knows it, is going to create quite a reaction in Moscow. But we also have some people in the administration, I'm thinking of Nikki Haley, the ambassador to the United Nations, making kind of traditional hawkish statements about Russia that could have come from Samantha Power's mouth, for example. We have Vice President Mike Pence, who clearly comes from that side of the party, some of the people in the offices. Then we also have the kind of Bannonite folks who often hold White House positions, who have a very different view on Russia. How do you see our Russia policy evolving in this
Well, I think
setting?
that President Trump has already indicated that what he wanted to do with Russia has become impossible because of all this pressure and supposition of that he is either under the sway of Russia, or that there may be some compromising materials called compromat in Russian against him, or that there are people in his campaign and in his entourage, presidential entourage, that somehow have some deep and dark associations, non-transparent associations with Russia. So it's already working, and I think that what has happened, I mean, Trump has because I think he went to military academy, and he never served in the military. I think he has this kind of an innate respect for people who have a lot of money and people who had high-ranking positions in the military. And in a sense, he's appointed people in the military to key policy-making positions, the Secretary of Defense and the head of the National Security Council. And I think that this was initially a thought by his evil genius, Steve Bannon, to have non-political people in these positions so that Bannon and people who had the ideology of cooperating with Putin could push them in the right direction. But what they didn't count on was that these people actually have their own strategic views, and they are very hawkish, and they know the facts. Steve Bannon has maybe some theories about conservative and traditional societies, Russia and the United States allying to defeat secularism and Islam together. And I mean Islam, I don't mean Islamism. I think that there's an opposition to the influence of a non-Judeo-Christian impulse
in Bannon's case, a non-Christian impulse. I mean, I don't think we should come slack on that one.
Maybe, I don't know. I haven't dealt that deeply into it. But what I would say is that this trend has not really worked. You've got now experts with very sound, solid, and I would say hawkish, or I would say pragmatic, realistic policy positions as the head of the UN. I think there will be a kind of a traditionalization of how the State Department deals with Russia. I think these guys are kind of under the gun, and as long as these investigations go on, as long as there is this supposition of a Russian hand and a Russian influence, and I think this is going to go on for months and months, U.S. policy will kind of congeal, and it'll be very difficult to do an about-face, and it'll be very difficult for Trump to do an about-face, especially if his ratings are as low as they have been over the last month and a half. Now, one last thing on the Russia question. Not only was there the Tomahawk missile attack on the airbase, but President Putin has already responded to say that Russia will be supplying air defenses to upgrade the air defenses of the Syrians, which means that President Trump's action has already meant that the Kremlin is targeting U.S. Servicemen and U.S. airplanes through a proxy war, and that through a proxy, and that also is going to raise tension. So steps that have been taken by the president for whatever reasons, and this scrutiny, I think, are pushing him further and further away from the Bannonite idea of an alliance with Putin.
And that's an important point about what Putin has done, because if you were planning that out with the president, this is not a 6 moves down the chessboard thing that Putin has done. This is half a move. It was entirely predictable. In fact, you could argue that if you're Vladimir Putin, you almost have no other option here, right? So one wonders. It's not just a more traditional approach, but it's actually ratcheting up the tension. But I wanted to maybe probe what you were...
But let me just say one important point. I think you're right that it's a half move ahead, but what it proves is that Putin no longer harbors the idea that in the foreseeable future, some kind of a new rapprochement or an alliance with the United States is possible. I think he would have done what he did after the expulsion of Russian agents by the Obama administration, which was nothing. He wanted to make a kind of a peace offering to the next president. Right. He's no longer doing that.
Right. So he's changed his views based on what Donald Trump has done. But I want to ask another question to follow up on your discussion of the people in the administration, because another point, and maybe this is part of what you were trying to say, is that governance is difficult. You know, it's not easy being Secretary of Defense, President of the United States, a major ambassador position, and many of the people on the Bannonite side, including that Trump himself, if he is in fact on that side, have no experience in this. So the Mattises, the McMasters, they may not be insiders in the sense of held office for decades, but they've been in the game and they understand how difficult this is. But another, so that's one kind of piece that also says that...
Well, I would say they have one other advantage, that is that they actually have deep knowledge of the adversary
and that's part
deep
of knowing
knowledge of Russia. And I think it's and the problem for Trump was that, and the problem for Bannon is that it's impossible to fill out a White House and to fill out a State Department and a Defense Department with people that don't have experience and competence. There are no people who share the views of Trump and Bannon who have some experience in...
It's also true in domestic policy. This is why the health care proposal failed so badly. But so that's one piece. But the other piece of it is, if we look at this in a broader historical context, what we see is a new president who comes in from a new party running an outsider campaign. And look, this is America. Everybody besides George H.W. Bush and Richard Nixon run outsider campaigns, right? You can do it in various degrees, but that is how you get to the White House. Right. And they come in and they say, we're going to shake things up dramatically. And what they find is that there's much less bandwidth. There's much less room in which to maneuver than they had thought. So is that just these kind of traditional forces are closing in on Trump in that sense?
Well,
on President Trump in that sense?
Look, I think that there is a sort of an established policy consensus, and it's like reality and what exists is very sticky. Ronald Reagan came in to slash taxes. In the end, he probably decreased federal taxes by about 2%, which was a lot, and it was very disruptive for social programs and so on and so forth. But it was, relative to the federal budget, it was a kind of a minuscule move downward. So in a sense, you're operating. You've got so many things that are you could slash the defense budget, but you can only do it so much because there are long-term procurements and so on. And then you have all the personnel costs and the costs of rolling things out. So they're just you can try to do the same thing with social programs, but again, you find that there is a very strong constituency. Then you start worrying about all these things. So there's a lot of stickiness. And then there's the United States has been a democracy for a couple centuries. It's developed certain kinds of habits. It has an independent judiciary. Things are a little harder to do. The Congress has its own calculations, and if you're weak in the polls, I think it sends a signal. Certainly the Senate seems to be more independent. The House is kind of,
That's how Washington works.
Yeah, the House seems to be more eager to go Trump's way, but if his numbers continue to be as low as they are at 35 or 38% approval, they're going to get more nervous the closer they come to the election. And we've already seen people on the far right and moderate Republicans both scuttle his first major initiative. So a lot of things that Trump wants to do domestically as well as internationally are being pushed by reality. And what they're being pushed by, in a sense, is by the views of the American electorate in an odd way through our, admittedly, filtered through the representational system. But the point is, I think the American public took a chance on Trump, but didn't buy into all the craziness that he was talking about. They were just unhappy. They wanted, they felt, that something needs to be shaken up. But now they realize, and they probably didn't believe half the stuff he talked about, but they basically thought he's a guy who's going to, he's willing to go beyond where no one has gone before, and they don't want it.
And elections are clumsy instruments. You walk in, you have a choice really between two people, and you can be voting on an enormous number of things. So you're going to get, this isn't going to happen. But you're, I think, if I'm hearing you correctly, kind of telling a theory, if you will, that Trump is being, the Trump erratic behavior, the Trump inconsistent and bizarre policy views are being reined in by a Washington the way with more rational presidents who also come in with more innovative ideas, it gets reined in too, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. Right. So this leads me to my next question, and there's a multi-part question. So the big picture is, how does this end with regards to Russia? Where could this go? But the second piece of that is important here is that we haven't talked, except for in passing, about Trump's own potential, possible, we don't know because the information's tax returns, et cetera, aren't out there, connections with Russia, financial and otherwise. We have heard rumors, which really just rumors, so we're not going to really talk about them there, but what we know is that Trump has been in real estate for a long, long time, that real estate is a debt game, that finding friendly people to lend you money at low interest is critically important in that business. We also know that his son-in-law, who is now the first Jewish president, is in the real estate game and also may have some of these ties. So I'm curious, do you think we're ever going to get to the bottom of that? And if not, can we ever really resolve this?
Well, I think that there are two issues that need to be separated out. I'm pretty sure that there is Russian money in Trump real estate deals. Whether it's just Russian oligarchs laundering money and buying large chunks of a Trump project, or whether it's some potential credits that may have been given. I think that there is some of that presence. The real question is whether that was done with the intent of having political influence or whether there was some kind of a quid pro quo. That's a harder thing to prove, and I'm not sure that is likely. On the other hand, these relationships with Russian businessmen were clearly understood by the Kremlin as a potential point of influence, as a potential point of socialization. Basically, here's a guy, especially when he started, showing an interest in running for president. I'm sure these guys in the Kremlin and in the Russian military intelligence and the security services started looking at who has relationships with all the candidates, and then they found a motherlode, a treasure trove of relationships with the Trump team, the Trump family, and so on. And then I think they started working. And then the question is, was there anything illicit there? And that's another part of the investigation. But I'm pretty sure that that these relationships exist. It's just that's the way people move their money. They move their money into real estate.
Adrian, thank you very much. That's all the time we have. Thank you, Adrian Karatnycky, for being here, and thank you for watching this edition of Represent NYC on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Lincoln Mitchell. Goodbye.